In Lecture 2, in Module 1, we're going to be discussing critical constructionism. Again, hopefully you have definitely acquired the textbook, the required reading for this course, and you'll notice that the author, Robert Heiner, has titled it Social Problems. The subtitle is An Introduction to Critical Constructionism. So it's obviously very important that we understand this concept that is going to be the basis for which we examine many of these issues we call social problems. And the quickest way to explain critical constructionism is to say it helps us answer two things when it comes to this issue of social problems. Why now, or why all of a sudden, and why this and not that, right? So in my previous lecture, we talked about this issue of child abuse, which most of us, I think, would agree is quote unquote bad, right? But wasn't always considered a social problem. So we would ask ourselves, well, if we all agree pretty much universally today that child abuse is a social problem, then why wasn't it considered a social problem? Or what were some of the issues that kept it from being so? And one of the things we can talk about, again, it comes back to this idea of critical constructionism, which we're going to explain now. And basically, critical constructionism is a synthesis of two very important sociological perspectives. Again, if you had intro to sociology, especially if you had it with me, you will have heard some of these terms before. If not, we'll definitely run through them right here, okay? So a perspective is just a way of looking at something. Sociology has many, many, many different perspectives, right? Different ways of looking at things, all of which are equally valid. It's just, kind of like, the different ways that people see the same thing and describe them or experience them differently. So critical constructionism involves conflict theory, right? Which is, again, the idea that this was developed largely by Karl Marx, but is expanded on greatly by many people over time. Karl Marx started with this idea that society is comprised of groups that compete with each other for resources. Okay? Another theory you might be familiar with or perspective is functionalism, the idea that society is everybody working together to create the greater whole. Conflict theory is pretty much in direct opposition to that. But the idea of, that Marx came up with, and many of you have heard this, the conflict between workers and capitalists, or the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, are the very theoretical, the more sociological names for these things. But that groups in society compete with each other. Now, obviously, modern conflict theory expands well beyond the idea of just workers and capitalists or workers and employees to include basically any group. So conflict theory can involve race, it can involve gender, it can involve political parties, it could involve all sorts of different groups that make up society, and that these groups have their own individual wants, desires, and needs, and competes with other groups in society to get those things for themselves. So we could definitely talk about things, like I said, rich and poor, different racial or ethnic groups, the difference between the genders, men and women. And now with our expanded definition, obviously, of gender and sexuality, the conflict that goes on between, cis and trans. So there's all sorts of different ways that groups can compete and conflict with each other in society. Part of the main issue with conflict theory involves inequality, that some groups are going to be, quote unquote, more powerful than others, right? And we often refer to those people in power, this is a term we use quite a bit in this semester, the elite. So the people at the top of these competitions, the people who generally have an advantage over other groups when it comes to these competitions for resources, are considered the elite. We'll be using that word quite a bit. And their influence on the social structure is generally to benefit themselves, right? That's the basis of conflict theory, that you're trying to get more for yourself or for your group. So conflict theory tends definitely to be very critical of capitalism as an economic system. We'll go into more detail about that. But basically, it's kind of that idea of, if you're successful in capitalism, you probably are extremely rich and powerful, and therefore have an advantage over other groups that you will use to your advantage to gain more of what you want in society. So it does tend to be very critical, a lot of capitalism. We'll go into that in more detail, definitely in this semester. Another thing to think about sometimes is the elite. We tend to sometimes fall down kind of a rabbit hole of conspiracy theory to, think of the elite as some kind of united group that meets among themselves. We again take it to extremes when we think about the Illuminati, or people meeting in secret enclaves and tops of mountains and castles and wearing specific type of clothing. The elite are comprised of people who are looking out for basically themselves, right? Any group that is basically looking out for itself and has similar characteristics doesn't necessarily have to conspire or meet with each other or even be in contact with each other to act basically in unison with one another, right? So again, sometimes defined as a unity of interests that kind of binds people together. And again, this idea of some of the value judgments that are attached to this, are things like the elite are bad, and those people that are being neglected or affected by them, are the quote unquote good guys. We sometimes overgeneralize when we talk about the elite to assuming that it's some type of evil conspiracy, which isn't necessarily the case sociologically. And then the second theory that we're talking about here is called symbolic interactionism. Over here so you can see it a little bit better, right? Symbolic interactionism is made up of two very important words: symbol, right? And a symbol is anything with any kind of attached meaning to it. Once again, if you had me for introduction to sociology, you'll know that oftentimes I draw a what looks like a stop sign, a red octagon on the board, and say, what does that mean? And universally, everybody will say that means stop. And I'm like, how do you know that means stop? I didn't write the word stop on it. It's a symbol. It's got an attached meaning to it. And for you to be part of our society, you know what that symbol means. The fact that it's 8-sided and I drew it in red means it's a stop sign, right? We see them commonly when we're out driving around in traffic. We see them when we're taking an exam and we have to, not go on to the next page. We see them on doors and buildings for rooms indicating that we're not supposed to go into. So all these things together demonstrate that we know what that symbol means, right? And it's pretty impossible to get through society without recognizing the symbols of the society. So again, George Herbert Mead, a very, very, very important sociologist, talked about language being a system of symbols and the thing that basically makes us different than any other creature on the face of the planet. Again, we can get into the issue of, do other animals have the ability to communicate? Sure they do. Trees have the ability to communicate, but demonstratively there's not another creature on the planet that has language, the ability to communicate abstract ideas to one another. And this makes us the dominant species on the planet. So again, when we look at this idea of symbols, what we're thinking about when it relates to social problems is, what are the symbols associated with it, right? So when we think of the word crime, what does that mean to us? Does it mean the same thing to everybody in here? Another thing not necessarily associated with social problems is education. Just think of the word college, right? Is that a symbol? Of course it is, right? And we each interpret that symbol differently. Is the experience of a student at Hack different than the experience of a student at big residential college like Penn State? Of course it is. Those two people are having very different experiences, even though they're experiencing the same quote unquote symbol, right? So we definitely know that when it comes to social problems, do all people in society experience quote unquote crime in the same way? Just think about it in terms of class, upper, middle, lower, right? Just think about upper and lower, right, classes. Are those two groups very likely to experience crime in different ways? You would probably say yes. People of the lower class are probably much more likely to experience crime on an intimate or personal level, such as having things stolen from them, having their homes burglarized, suffering from, violent assault, those kind of things. Whereas people of the upper classes are probably less likely to experience those things just by nature of maybe where they live or the amount of protection they can afford themselves. Even things like legal representation. And often engage in different types of crime. We often think about lower classes engaging in much more what we call street crime, classes are probably less likely to engage in street crime, like breaking into people's houses or mugging people, but are probably more likely to engage in corporate crime. Excuse me, things like tax evasion, fraud, those kind of things. Okay, so we definitely know that critical constructionism combines these two ideas. Okay? So when we talk about critical constructionism, basically what we're saying is, how do we find social problems by examining or introducing this dimension of how the elite in society help define. And again, I'm going to read from the book. This is on, depending on which edition you have, page 10. Critical constructionism holds that the way social problems are constructed, conceived, and presented to the public more often than not represents the interests of society's elite, excuse me, more than those of the mainstream, and often at the expense of those not in power. So we can think of these things, excuse me while I zoom in and zoom out, in terms of who is deciding what a social problem is and why are they deciding that. Okay? Again, to use my examples before, if we use crime for an example, right? Who decides what crimes are going to be prosecuted at a higher rate or with more vigorousness, vigor, I should say, than others? It's probably the people in charge who are going to determine, quote unquote, which crimes, and we'll talk about this in great detail in a future module, are going to be considered more serious in society. And as we can see, it's usually street crime, right? Because those are the types of crimes engaged in by the lower classes for the most part, right? And things that we call sometimes called white collar or corporate crime in society are not prosecuted as vigorously because, again, those are the crimes committed by the people in charge of the elite. And this brings up a really important topic, something called, and we'll talk about this in much more detail throughout the course, something called hegemony. Okay, very unusual word outside of sociology. People don't see it quite a bit, but it's pronounced, move so you can see, hegemony, right? And a 1920s Italian sociologist by the name of Antonio Gramsci came up with what he termed cultural hegemony, and you'll see some resources about this in the Module 1 shell. Let me tell you a little bit about Gramsci. So Gramsci, again, in the 1920s, was an Italian sociologist. He was very much opposed to fascism, kind of dictatorial type of government and rule that was going on in Italy at the time. Again, if you know about your history, you know about Benito Mussolini, the dictator who was an ally of Hitler's during World War II. So fascism was becoming a rapidly more popular type of political view, and Antonio Gramsci, very much against it, spoke out quite loudly about it and was imprisoned for that. And basically, so you can imagine him being in prison basically for speaking out against a political view and saying, how did this happen? How did I get here? How could it be that the society that I love could actually jail me for my thoughts? And the idea was what he called cultural hegemony. This idea of it is the thoughts and beliefs of the elite in society which are the ones that gain the most traction. Those are the ones that are most popular. And all other views then are considered, quote unquote, bad, incorrect, heretical. There's all sorts of terms for it. And we definitely know that this goes on in societies all the time, right? That the idea of what's considered right and wrong as far as thinking becomes what we call hegemonic. This idea of it's just the way things are, or it's just, but when we study hegemony, especially from the viewpoint of Gramsci, excuse me, what we have to do is look at how did that belief become the mainstream. So we're going to take a couple of closer looks at that when we look at, again, critical constructionism.